Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figure It Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here. Today we're going to be doing a discussion video on general pricing in retro games and some advice on what is perhaps the best time to actually get into the hobby, and perhaps if you've been priced out of the hobby and maybe it's too late for you, we'll see. But this is just a discussion video, and I'm very curious to see what a lot of people will have to say about it. Before we do that though, you guys do me a favor, please like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before, and check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, my Spreadshirt, my travel channel. I appreciate the support on those, especially Patreon right now. Thank you very much. I like having lights, what can I say? Anyway, so yeah, let's go ahead and discuss retro gaming pricing. So here's the thing. This is going to be kind of an economics video, because a lot of people will watch this thinking like this is your usual video about a guy being like, dude, games are too expensive now, this sucks. It's like, yes, that's true, but I kind of, rather than want to complain about it and say like, why are we all being priced out of this hobby, which of course everyone has an opinion on, oh, it's WADA's fault, oh, it's COVID's fault, oh, it's X country's fault, it's whatever. I'm not here to make that case. I'm not here to talk about any of that. That's just kind of scenery, factors, whatever. Although I am genuinely curious what you guys will have to say before that and potentially after this. I want to talk about general economic trends that cause the average video game prices to be the way they are. And we're going to be talking kind of demographics here, because this is not simplistic. It's not just, hey, COVID did it. It's not that simple. Nothing in life ever is. It's generational. There's a lot of X factors, so we're going to grossly oversimplify it because it's kind of the only way we can do this in any realistic amount of time. But yeah, this is mostly about generational trends. So what you need to understand with basic economics when it comes to something collectible, let's say anything that we like to buy that we know is expensive now or cheap now or whatever, there is a general release cycle that is actually mathematically predictable. So I want to teach you that, because that will be the best way for you to get into the hobby should you ever choose to. That basically will teach you what the best time is, second best time, worst time, etc. So when a product originally comes out, that is when it is obviously at its most flat, basic rate. And the general rule with collecting is anything that is going to become valuable at one time has to first become worthless. Which sounds illogical, but there's a reason for it. If something comes out, it is made available to the public, and the public had access to it, but chose effectively to reject it and not, embrace it, it means that A, that it was released, the public had its chance, which tends to drive the market, but B, that it rejected it, and therefore there's much less of it available. So the eventual through line of that is that people want something that no longer really exists. As opposed to, say, something that was never intended for release. That's like the art market. Things like one-off paintings, or in my case, I have access to the Sega Pluto prototype and the Atari Jaguar Hot Rod dental unit. Those things were never released to the public, therefore they're super valuable, but only in the way of like the art market is, where you'd have to auction it off specifically. Incidentally, I'm not the owner of either of those devices. I wish I was, because then I could retire. But no, those are just devices I have access to as a YouTuber. So, yeah, so that's a key point. For general trends of consistently valuable products, you have to, find your dive before you find your high up. Okay, so a product will come out when it's originally released. That is an essential moment, because that will determine the initial success of the device or product, whatever it is, and it will also determine how many of them are available. So if something is wildly successful, there will be tons of them out there. Now, this will eventually generate additional nostalgia for people who want to go back and buy it, but that will reach a certain cap as far as how valuable it is. Let's take something more somewhat modern, like say iPods. iPods are now somewhat valuable because everybody's like, oh, I kind of want to go back and get an iPod. Those things were kind of cool, right? But they were mass produced excessively. So it's not really that hard to find them. It just, costs you more than it did when they were totally worthless. However, if you find something, let's say gaming related, that is super expensive now, that one time was worthless entirely, it's because of rarity. So let's say Panzer Dragoon Saga for the Sega Saturn, very infamous game. Now, when that game came out at its base flat point, nobody really picked it up. Sega only made 10,000 copies of that game. It was out there. You had your chance. Nobody really took it. So as a result, it's officially part of the collection. It's a very good game, which is a mix. Also, uniquely in that game's case, the source code is lost, so it's unre-releasable. But it was out there, and technically you can get it. And that little carrot of it always just being there tends to drive the market, knowing it was possible, and I screwed up. That's a factor. But because it wasn't widely available, you have no choice but to go through the super collectors that already have it, saying, all right, well, if you want it, it's going to cost you like $1,000 or whatever it is. So, baseline, your original price. That is the moment that determines mostly everything. So if a product fails or is not successful or just underperforms, that's the first step required. If something is super successful, like I said, it can have its nostalgia wave later like the iPod, but nobody's paying like $700 for an iPod because it's unnecessary. There's enough of them out there to avoid that. So from there, you have a little bit of time to figure out how much you care about a product. Okay? So after about, I would say within a year or two, maybe even up to 3, that's actually your best time to buy anything after it's released. So again, let's put this in video game terms. In video game cycles, let's go a more historical example here. Atari 2600, right? Stuff came out and was mass produced like crazy. There was just way too much of it. I mean, that's a whole story in of itself. But eventually the system is defunct. They're not really supporting it that much anymore. And there's way too much content. Now that's a gross oversimplification because that's such an infamous example, but it does kind of work really well to explain this. It's just the sheer amount of volume of content and the sheer lack of demand made Atari stuff in the mid-early 80s very worthless. Nobody wanted it. To the point where they were dumping it in disposal sites and Alamogordo and all that. But that was the peak time, if you wanted it, to buy it because it was worthless. Now that was off of a bunch of factors, but one of the constant factors that goes through other systems in less infamous cases, we can use something more recent, say the original Xbox transitioning to the Xbox 360, is when that transition happens, what typically occurs is that people say, oh, that's the old one. I don't really want that anymore because I want the new one. So I'm going to purge that stuff and I'll get back some money and then I'll get, I'll put it towards the next system. So around that time is the best time to start picking stuff up because people were getting rid of it. Stores don't want it anymore. They're not producing it anymore, but there's still a ton of units available. Okay, that's your peak time to buy it. Especially when people are going into that transition phase of, the next generation of stuff is right around the corner. That point, that's when you're supposed to buy things, which is easier said than done. I recognize that because you're like, Adam, I wasn't alive, when the Sega Genesis was transitioning to the Sega Saturn. I didn't have the option to go buy cheap Genesis stuff. I know, but I'm just saying that this is just a history lesson on how this works, and you can potentially use this for the future. So that's when you want to get into it. But what eventually happens is stuff stays kind of cheap-ish for a little bit. And then after a few years, the average would be about from 20 years from the point of release to the point of nostalgic boom. But in between, there's like a good 5 years of it being cheap. Once the nostalgic boom starts to hit, that's like the worst time possible. So again, we'll use video games obviously as a perfect example here. I'm old enough to remember in the mid-90s, after the Genesis and the SNES were no longer being supported, they weren't the official priorities of Sega or Nintendo. They were focusing on N64, Saturn, etc. You couldn't get rid of Genesis and SNES stuff. Nobody wanted it. They would not take it. I remember a buddy of mine wanted to get a PS1. And he took his Super Nintendo collection and his Sega Genesis collection, like both systems. He had like 50 games for each. And it was like, collectively it must have been like $1,000 worth of stuff. And he basically took it to then FuncoLand and was like, I want a PS1, which of course was the new system. It was like $300. And they're like, we'll give you like $100 in store credit. And he took it. Because that's the era that was. I never subscribed to that policy. I always knew that was bad economics. Even as a child, I was conditioned to know that's a bad deal, don't take that. But not everybody has that luxury, and I grant you. But when you don't have that luxury, you're the ones being exploited. So somebody else won that deal. When you traded all that away, FuncoLand won that deal. Point is, stuff gets really cheap around then. And then a few years later, when the generation that played stuff as kids gets old enough to the point where usually just past college, they've got their first job, they got some money, they have some sense of responsibility, they typically get to this point where they're recognizing their life is changing. When you get out of college especially and you enter the workforce, there's this moment where you realize, like, it's called a quarter life crisis usually, where you realize, like, the life I always knew growing up and the safety of my parents' home and the school system and all that, that is actually over. It's over. I now have to be an adult. I have to do this adult thing. And the typical psychological effect of that is that people go, I'm afraid. And they go back and they buy their childhood. This is very normal. Something about their childhood that keeps them grounded. And in our case, a lot of times that would be video games. So a lot of people go back and buy the stuff they got rid of as kids. This massively drives the market up. And this wave happens about every 20 years, which is why right about now we're dealing with 6th generation nostalgia, which is why Dreamcast, GameCube, and to a lesser extent PS2 and Xbox are skyrocketing in prices because the generation that had them as little children, that was 20 years ago. Think about that. Makes you feel old, right? So they're driving the prices up on that stuff. But again, it's a wave. So what eventually happens is those guys, the ones that pick stuff up for nostalgic reasons, they start to exit their 20s and enter their 30s and recognize, like, hey, you know, I am an adult now, and I want a relationship, I want a house, I want kids, I want a family, the whole thing. And they go, do I really need, like, an entire, you know, Sega Genesis set? Is that really going to do anything for me anymore? I don't have time for this. And they sell it. But they're also a series of collectors, so they understand, hey, I'm not going to just sell it for nothing. You know, I'll sell it for a little bit something. That's your second wave of, you know, cheapness. Because like I said, this whole thing kind of goes like that. So this is why NES, Genesis, and SNES have actually significantly fallen in the last few years. Because I remember going, like, you know, 10 years ago, I was constantly, you know, hustling around, picking up other things. I wasn't too focused on those systems because they were just too expensive. But everybody I knew was just like, I want NES games, and they were buying up massive amounts of them, and they were just like, they're super expensive. They'd come in and, like, look at the label and be like, okay, it's perfect condition. Okay. It's like you see this game, and like, here's $500 for it, and you're just like, I'm sitting there going like, wow. Because that was their nostalgia thing. That's what they wanted. But now, as I said, they're all out of it. I got a bunch of friends who were like, I don't know why I did any of that. I'm just going to sell all that stuff. And it cost me $500. I'll sell it for $250. I don't care. You know, and then they start dropping the prices back down. So, again, ebbs and flows. Now, eventually what happens, again, is those same guys who had the kids, had the wife, all that, the kids are out of the house. You know, they've retired from the job. There's not much else to do. What's my retirement plan? Now, some people say, oh, I'll travel the world or whatever it is. But some of them go right back to that childhood goal. They're like, you know what? I'm at home all the time. This makes me feel happy. I don't have to answer to anybody. I am retired. I'll do what I want. And they go back and buy stuff. And this leads to a bit of a resurgence where stuff was seen as completely dead and comes back. This would be the case with stuff like Atari 2600. So Atari 2600, only a couple years ago, just boxes of worthlessness. And it's not like it's super valuable now. And it's, in this unique case, Atari themselves is kind of pushing it on people. But there is actually a generation of elderly people. Sorry to anyone out there you're not really elderly, I'm exaggerating. Who is starting to be like, all right, I kind of want that stuff back. And that gives it another uplift. Where it will truly collapse. And we just haven't... Here's the thing about this. You can predict this wave to a certain extent, but this has not been around. Video games have not been around as a form of entertainment long enough for us to see how this eventually plays out. But there will predictably, very soon, within the next 20 years, be a generation of gamers who simply do not exist anymore. And the eldest generation of content that they produced and they loved will have no audience, other than those who look at it for historical purposes. And that might be the deadest point it ever gets. We don't know that yet for sure, at least in the context of video games. But at the same time, that's also the phase in which the least amount of it still exists. And whatever's left over, that's the kind of stuff that ends up in museums one day. It's interesting. It's all ebbs and flows. So if I'm going to use a very recent example here, because I understand this wave and I'm trying to teach it to you, I will tell you openly, if you like a system and you want to collect for it, the best time to do it is while it's still relevant but kind of waning. So the Wii U was my most recent accomplishment in that regard. And I knew this was going to happen because the Wii U was not successful. So I was like, okay, this immediately fails that first test, you know, where it comes out. How does it do? If it's wildly successful, then it has a threshold. If it fails, then potentially the limit is way higher. The Wii U was a failure. I saw that right away. And so I said, okay, I want to get on board with this. But I'm not going to buy every game retail the second it comes out because that'll be also prohibitively expensive. So you just kind of wait. In each game, you wait a year or two. Nothing's going to get that crazy rare. Nobody's supporting this system. There's not that many games for it. You can keep an eye on it. So if you guys actually can check this for yourselves in the history of this channel, watching things like Playload and my collection pickups and all that other stuff, you can see it. I'm like, I picked up this Wii U game, nobody cared, $5, whatever. You pick it up, and now it's like hundreds of dollars. Things like that Turbo game or the Crudes or any of the stuff on the Wii U that's rare. Because I was picking up when just genuinely nobody cared, because I'm like, this is how it's always going to work. And eventually completed the whole set, and it's totally done. And I promise you, in about 10 years from now, Wii U stuff will be at its absolute peak of expense. Now, would I sell it? No. Sorry if you hear any sirens outside. The thing with all of this is that it does price a lot of people out of the hobby because they don't know exactly which part of the wave they're in and what they're supposed to do with it. So it is funny because, like, I'm somewhat guilty of that because I don't sell any of this stuff, but I stopped paying attention to it at a certain point. I remember in 2008, I completed my Dreamcast set. And I was buying it truly when nobody cared. As I said, that was only a couple years after everything was over, so nobody cared about any of it. I got the Dreamcast kiosk, the Divers 2000, all the games. I remember picking up Mars Matrix for like $5 brand new at a Toys R Us because nobody cared. And then years later, people are like, how do I get a copy of Mars Matrix? And my old information is still in there of like, oh, it only costs $5. And they're like, what are you talking about? It's like hundreds of dollars now. Like I said, the wave. So my advice to you, if you are an aspiring collector, pay attention to a system and start picking up only a couple years after stuff's out. Right now, obviously that would be Switch, PS5, and Xbox Series X. And in all those cases, Switch would be very complicated because of how much content is on there. It depends on what you want to collect, if you want full sets or whatever your goal is. But yeah, Switch is kind of a decent time to pick stuff up right now if you care about that. Same with PS4. Very good time to pick stuff up. Xbox One, also a good time to pick stuff up. But now we're getting to a point where we're starting to see 360 nostalgia and PS3 nostalgia where it's starting to rise too. So we're already a little bit past that point. As crazy as that sounds. I do admit though I have a lot of regrets in this because I kind of was aware of this early on. So like in the early aughts, I picked up like tons of Sega hardware. I picked up tons of Nintendo hardware, Atari hardware, various games, etc. But there were some systems I just never got back to. Like the GameCube, I never completed the way I wanted it to, and I probably never will at this point. It's kind of prohibitively expensive. N64, kind of the same deal. Although N64 is falling for that reason already discussed. So if I were to complete any of those, it'll take another like 10, 20 years, which is just like a lot of work, and I don't know if I care about that at that point, but we'll see. Anyway, the point of this video is to just give you guys an economics like lesson when it comes to retro video games specifically. And hopefully this taught you a little bit about when it is a good time to get in there. But I am genuinely curious if you guys have other thoughts on this, because I everywhere I go all these conventions and everything, and I see all these games that I've had or consoles I've got, etc., that are just ludicrously expensive. I'm just sitting there thinking like, you're pricing everybody out of the hobby. because while the ebbs and flows thing is absolutely true, there are external factors to gaming specifically. And while I am all for it, I'm all inclusive in gaming in every way, bring everybody in, open tent, let's go. I will say the sheer number of people who have come into the retro gaming hobby casually is a new phenomenon. That didn't used to be a thing. And as a result, it has driven up prices because you have more people who are just checking it out to check it out. And I realize I'm actually part of the problem there because it's people like us on YouTube who have actually somewhat facilitated that, which is, again, all inclusive, bring it in. But at the same time, it does kind of mess with the model a bit. But, you know, it is what it is. Because initially, like I said, part of the reason everything gets so worthless so quickly is so many people end up purging that stuff because they just see it as like, I had my fun, my casual fun, I'm not really committed to this hobby, and I'm willing to get rid of it for nothing. That's why I said, a couple years in, that's the best time possible. After that, it just starts getting a lot harder, but you have to time it. And is it really worth timing over the course of decades? Probably not, but yeah. So yeah, any thoughts you guys have, I'd be very curious to hear them, what you think about the state of retro gaming in general. I used to be a little bit more opposed to things like the NES Classic and the SNES Classic and whatever, because I don't know, I always felt they were just kind of, you know, messing with the hobby. But now I'm actually more in support of it because if that can get the nostalgia bug out of the system for a lot of people, then, you know, potentially that helps to bring prices down, although it didn't really seem to do that all that much. So, I don't know. But yeah. Anyway, so that's just my random thoughts on this subject. Curious to hear what everybody else has to say. Thank you so much for watching. Again, if you guys could please like the video, comment down below, subscribe if you've never done that before. Check out all the social media stuff in the description: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. Appreciate the support. Thank you so much, and I'll see you all later.